imagine he has a big target on his back, a former government spokesman who resigns and says we're going to lose.
I think it's probably a good thing he takes the heat off the rest of us who are on the death list.
I know they're after you, Colonel, because I've seen that stuff. I haven't gotten word that they're after me, but I trust if you hear that, you'll give me a heads up.
Well, if I'm still around, I will. Absolutely. If I suddenly disappear, you don't need any further confirmation.
All right, let's talk about the wish of President Zelensky and his military commander for tanks, and the absurd footsie that the Americans seem to be playing with the Germans over the tanks. Everybody wants these German tanks, and Joe Biden's getting in the middle of it. Do they know what the hell they're doing?
Well, I think it's pretty clear they don't. In fact, I think this is an important theme that we should address, because the mood in Washington has very definitely changed. The attitude of the Washington community, and that I'm talking about those people that are the leading senators, members of the House, cabinet officers, president, vice president. The mood of these people has clearly changed. I think they're sensing that this is a lost cause, that Ukraine is very definitely going to lose. And they're trying to figure out, how do we prolong the suffering? How do we prolong this fighting? They'll say publicly it's for the purpose of, quote unquote, harming Russia, which has been a complete fiasco and a disaster, because Russia, frankly, has not been harmed very much. Not at all, I would say, in substantive terms, economically, financially, otherwise. But I think that's part of it. The second thing is that they're now really goading the Europeans, the Germans in particular, into committing acts that, frankly, can be regarded legally anywhere in the world as acts of war against Russia. And I think the German government is sitting there saying, do we really want to supply heavy military equipment, tanks, artillery, all these things in great quantities to this war zone to help these Ukrainians fight the Russians? Are we not, in fact, becoming co-belligerents? Now, you and I have talked before about this.
Yes.
I don't think there's any doubt about it. We are co-belligerents, but I think the Germans are now interested in putting the brakes on that. So Scholz put us in a difficult position, because his representative at Ramstein last week at the conference for donors and allies that were willing to send things to Russia said that the only way the Germans would send any tanks, Leopard tanks, was if we sent M1s. Then we went through a series of comments from people in the Department of Defense, like this Mr. Colin Kahl, Assistant Secretary of Defense in OSD, who said, well, the M1 is a gas guzzler, and it has extreme maintenance requirements. It's too complex for the Ukrainians. It won't help them. The Leopard's easier for them to use, and the Leopard would be better.
Now, you have agreed with that, haven't you?
Oh, well, I agree with it, but not for the reasons that Mr. Kahl said. I mean, we've known for 30 years that the gas turbine engine's a catastrophe, both for reasons of fuel usage, but also because of the intake of all the dirt and sand and nonsense on the ground. This is an engine designed for the use of a jet at 15,000 feet, not for use on the ground. So here we have this turbine engine that's supposed to power this tank up and send it at 50 or 60 miles an hour towards the enemy. The problem is that historically, that's not necessarily what you need from the tank. I mean, tank doesn't have to go 50 or 60 miles an hour. We don't need to cover all that ground again. But the bottom line is that the M1's got a lot of problems. There's no question about it. I don't think people wanted to see this employed for the fear that they would be embarrassed by its performance. Not the gun, not the crew, but the tank as a whole, for the reasons we mentioned. So now the tables have turned. In order to get the Germans to send tanks, apparently President Biden said, well, we'll send 10 M1s. And Mr. Scholz responded by saying, well, fine, then we'll send 10 Leopards. Now, this seems childish and stupid, but I think we need to understand what's really happening. Number one, people have no faith in Ukraine's ability to win this war. We have been lying about what's happening in Ukraine between the Russian and Ukrainian forces for months. We have been exaggerating Russian losses, exaggerating Russian problems, and minimizing and obviating Ukrainian problems and losses. The truth is seeping out. You can't conceal it much longer. So the first thing is they know they can't win. In other words, we're losing the proxy war. Our proxy can't win it. Secondly, the Europeans are concluding that this is dangerous. You know, how far out do we stick our necks? And they don't have the military industrial power to rapidly produce anything. And I think this is enormously important. The lead time, for instance, for the AMRAAM missile, which is a very important weapon that's used in the F-15, the F-22, the F-35, and by NASAMS, this, brilliant, what I would call it, brilliant air defense system that we and the Norwegians have put together with Kongsberg. It's excellent for shooting down cruise missiles, helicopters, so forth. The problem is that from the moment you ask for a missile, the wait time until you get it is 32 months.
Oh.
That's how long it takes to produce these things. When you look at all of the missiles that we're promising the Ukrainians and the systems, they're not going to arrive in any short period of time. Now, the Germans are talking about giving the Ukrainians air defense systems like the Patriot, and they'll probably provide them with some missiles. But you'll go through those missiles very rapidly, and you just can't replace them. So the Europeans and we do not have the surge capacity to fight a major war. We just don't have it. The Russians do. Their factories are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Contrary to popular belief, they're not running out of anything. They've got more of what they need than they've ever had. So all of this is dangerous. That's what we're learning from the Europeans now in private.
You stated at the outset of this last statement you made that you have sensed from public sources, and I guess from the people with whom you communicate regularly, a change in attitude on the part of decision makers in Washington. Now, I would imagine that what you have sensed is below the radar, and it hasn't yet bubbled up into the public consciousness.
No.
I mean, maybe Joe Biden's a bad example, but a hawk like Lindsey Graham, you're not going to hear him saying tomorrow the Russians are going to win and we ought to get the hell out of there, even though he may be whispering that to your friends and colleagues in D.C.
Well, see, that's an important point because I don't think they're whispering that. See, this is the great danger that we face right now. A couple of historians contacted me and they insisted they talk to me. And they walked me through all of the things that FDR did as president in the 1930s to effectively goad the Japanese into attacking our forces in the Pacific.
Right.
And we all knew, I mean, contrary to popular belief, the Navy, the Army, Marshall, the CNO of the Navy, Stark, all these people knew that the Japanese could, in fact, attack and destroy Pearl Harbor. And in the run-up to the war, FDR did several things. He put out something called the McCullum Memorandum and directed the Navy to deliberately violate Japanese home waters.
Yes.
And they did it with warships again and again and again. And he was told by the CNO, we could lose some ships. He said 2 or 3 ships is okay if we have to lose that. I mean, this is incomprehensible today, but that's what he said. And ultimately, they told him what the implications were, and he said, continue to do it. Ultimately, we know what happens. He leaves the fleet deliberately in 1941 in June in Pearl Harbor. He does not return the fleet to San Diego and San Francisco, where normally in Puget Sound, that's where the fleet in the Pacific was quartered, not in Hawaii. And the CNO said, Mr. Roosevelt, Mr. President, we're targets.
We're sitting ducks.
We could lose the fleet. Ultimately, you know the rest of the story. He deliberately did this. There are a lot of other things. He was sending as many bombers as he could to China, to Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers at the time. He wanted to build up an air force there that could firebomb Japan from China. This is in 1939, 40, 41. We don't talk about any of these things. And what they said is what is happening right now looks an awful lot like what FDR did. Now, I personally don't think that that's on President Biden's mind. But then again, I'm not sure President Biden is much more than the man who reads the script that's handed to him.
All right,
I don't know what the people behind him are up to, but if you look at what we're pushing, this is what brings you to the next point. The Ukrainians are going to face this onslaught. They have already said they can't withstand it. They're going to collapse. It's already beginning, and the Russians haven't even attacked in strength. What do we do then? Do we play this game of Polish forces, American forces, Romanian forces, whatever else we can get, and push some distance into Western Ukraine? Do we then take to confrontation?
I want to play the Russian side of this from Foreign Minister Lavrov 2 days ago in South Africa. Gary?
Мы говорим о том, что там происходит на Украине. Мы говорим о том, что эта война, она уже почти не гибридная, а почти настоящая, которую Запад долго готовил против России, стремясь уничтожить все русское от языка до культуры, что было на Украине столетиями, и запрещая людям говорить на...
Fair to say that he's speaking what President Putin thinks.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think not just President Putin, I think the majority of Russians. And it's a fair assessment based upon the things that we've been seeing over the last several years, unfortunately.
But this is a direct accusation by the internationally recognized foreign minister of Russia, pointing a finger at Washington, D.C. and the West as the prime motivators for this war. And then he uses this odd phrase, which you and I have discussed off air. He said, it's not a hybrid war, it's a war. What does he mean by hybrid war? What does this phrase mean?
This particular term was coined or invented by a former Marine major named Frank Hoffman. Very nice fellow. And I think it was really designed to somehow or another give the Marines justification for lots of Marine infantrymen to fight in future insurgencies. And what he was trying to talk about was today, hybrid war consists of men with rifles on the ground, media, external factors, other players in the international arena, game-changing weapons, all of this, instead of what we normally think of war as a more conventional confrontation with armies and air forces and so forth. And what Lavrov said, let's throw this hybrid nonsense out. We're talking about a real war. He's talking about high-end conventional warfare. It's not talking about nuclear warfare, but high-end conventional warfare. That's everything up to, but not including nuclear weapons. And he's saying this is being planned against us. That's a fair conclusion on his part based upon what you see us doing, trying desperately to provide enough support to the Ukrainians. Remember, our support goes beyond technology, goes beyond weapon systems and ammunition. It's information warfare. You know, we control the information highways. We are proselytizing for war against Russia. We are depicting Russia as this evil state, this nationalist state that rests on the foundation of Russian Orthodox Christianity. It protects its borders. It has an identity. Ergo, it must be destroyed. It must become like Western Europe and the United States, a country without borders, a country with identities that are being washed away in seas of illegal human trafficking, drug abuse, and so forth. That's what's at stake in their minds, and it's not an unreasonable assumption based upon what we're seeing. And he's saying, look, we're going to fight. And that's what we need to understand. They're not kidding, and we're not prepared for an all-out war. But
Are
Russia
the people in Washington who now are manifesting a change in mind aware of the defiance and forcefulness with which these kinds of statements out of the mouth of Mr. Lavrov have been made? And are they prepared to counter it by sitting down and talking to him? Do they think they're going to counter it militarily? And do they not realize that that's World War III if they do?
Well, first of all, I think it's very clear that under no circumstances are they going to hold talks with the Russians, because that would suggest that they've made a mistake.
Right. It would suggest that we're pulling the Zelensky strings, which of course we are.
Yeah. So it's not, I don't see us doing that. You know, I was asked the other day by a journalist, what do you think we should do? I said, hold talks immediately without preconditions. We need to come to some sort of resolution no matter what. That in fact, was essentially what Kissinger said a few months ago, and then, of course, changed his tune. We're not going to do that. That's an admission of failure. No one in Washington ever admits that they failed at anything. Everything's a success, no matter how many times you fail. That's the first problem. I think the second problem is there's a lot of arrogance and self-delusion. I don't think the people on the Hill really understand what war means anymore. I mean, for many, many years, we had lots of interesting people on the Hill. Sam Nunn was a good example, but there were many others. Most of them had served in the military. A lot of them lived through the Second World War. They understood what you meant when you started talking about war. So when it came to Russia, or in those days, the Soviet Union, people made it very clear that's not what we want. Whatever we do, we must find a way around that because we all know what that means. And they weren't necessarily saying it would be nuclear, but it would be so destructive and self-defeating, we don't want to engage in it. I don't sense that anymore.
What is your understanding of the latest numbers of military killed? Ukraine, Russia.
Well, Judge, first of all, this goes back to the fiction that we've been spinning about the war. We haven't told the truth about Ukrainian losses. It's becoming harder and harder to accept. We know from obituaries, we know from people on the ground in the hospitals treating the wounded. We know from the Ukrainians themselves who are posting things, comments on Telegram and sending videos. Ukrainians have lost easily 122,000, with absolute certainty, men killed on the battlefield. Secondly, they've admitted to roughly 35,000 missing in action, presumed dead. And if you go back to World War II and you look at German fatalities, there were almost 2 million casualties or dead, frankly, from the Second World War in Eastern Europe and the German Wehrmacht. And a substantial chunk of that, hundreds of thousands, were missing in action, presumed dead. They were never recovered. We have to understand that the majority of casualties being inflicted on the Ukrainians is a consequence of artillery fire, not just hard shell artillery, rocket fire, firing thermobaric warheads. These are the fuel air explosives that utterly destroy a whole area. This is how you avoid going into buildings where there may be people waiting for you. You fire a thermobaric warhead into the building, it eliminates the oxygen. It's destructive, but it kills everything because there's nothing to breathe. You have a whole range of these kinds of explosives. The Russians have great quantities of them. They use them very effectively because they are also linking these in real time to overhead surveillance. This is surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence platforms. So you're getting within seconds sometimes, certainly within a minute or two, accurate data to the artillery systems that can then fire. Keep in mind that the Russians can fire up to roughly 60,000 rounds a day. The Ukrainians are lucky to get off 6,000 or 7,000 rounds a day. In other words, tenfold more than the Ukrainians can fire in response.
Can you address you've indicated 122,000 dead, 35,000 unaccounted for, probably dead Ukrainian. What do your sources tell you is the number of dead or missing and unaccounted for on the Russian side?
What we're getting from the Russians, as well as from some the Ukrainian sources, are just, unfortunately, when it comes to the Russians, they're just not believable. But we are hearing from people on the battlefield, depending upon where you are and who you talk to. The Russians have had somewhere between 16,000, 17,000 and 25,000 killed, and perhaps another 25, 30, 40,000 wounded. And people say, well, how could that be? I just explained it to you. You have overmatch in firepower on a dramatic scale, on a strategic scale. That's why.
When will the globalists in Western Europe and in the State Department and the Defense Department come to the same realization that the political class in Washington has begun to achieve, that this is a losing fight and we have to change the mission?
Thus far, I haven't seen any evidence that there's any recognition of this. In fact, I continue to hear these disturbing comments that, well, if the Ukrainians have to fall back to the Polish border, then we'll fight a perpetual war against the Russians.
So this crazy president of Poland is going to send 100,000 Polish troops east over the border, and is going to beg Joe Biden to let the 101st Airborne join them?
Well, I don't think he has to beg. I think there are lots of people that would push for that. And remember, you've got at least the equivalent of 3 armor brigades from the United States on the ground in Poland and down in Romania, plus the 101st, plus other units, formations, artillery, and so forth. Then you have the Poles, as you point out, they've now mobilized at least 200,000. They're trying to build up a force of over 300,000. That would probably support the projection of somewhere between 60 and 100,000 troops on the ground. I don't know about the Romanian side, but I know that there are elections scheduled in Poland for the fall. I don't know exactly how the government thinks, but the Polish population, and this is very important. We also discussed this map of Europe that shows the various polling data. And what you get all across Europe from the publics is a very definite preference for a negotiated solution to this war as soon as possible. There is no evidence that anybody in Europe wants to go to war with Russia. And I'm beginning to see that happen in Poland, where more and more Poles are saying, wait a minute, we're literally on the edge of the abyss here. If this war spreads, we will be destroyed.
Doesn't the German public want inexpensive Russian natural gas back in their homes to heat them for the winter?
I'm sure some do, but not yet. I think there's this belief that somehow or another they can get past this tough winter and be ready next year with their alternative energy sources. This climate change business is more than a program. It's a religious faith in much of Europe, and particularly with the Germans and Scandinavians. It's quite strange. And real data don't make any difference anymore. Again, everything connected with this war is emotion.
All right. I'm going to assume, or I want you to assume, that everything you've just educated us on is known by Russian intel and is known.
They're running out of ammunitions or equipment or anything else, and they're turning out excellent equipment, brand new equipment in many cases. It's arriving very rapidly at the front. They now have a very large force, and it's getting larger every day. So I think the Europeans just never signed on for this, and the problem we have right now is that we grossly miscalculated on the Russians. We don't really understand them. We didn't pay any attention to them. We're staring strategic defeat in the face.
Have our supplies been depleted, and
Absolutely.
Are they in need of replenishment, the Americans, to the same extent that NATO's are?
Well, of course, you got to remember that if you look at something like the Javelin, a friend of mine at Raytheon told me that, and this was ultimately posted by Fox News in one of the articles, but a friend at Raytheon said, look, we've gone through almost 7 years of production of Javelins in Ukraine. It takes time to build these missiles, whether it's HIMARS or Raytheon's other products like NASAMS and so forth. All of these missiles are very complex, high-tech weapons. We've gone through our stockpiles very quickly, and we have no surge capacity, none. And that's something people don't understand. But the Russians have managed to very rapidly surge production. And the Europeans are very concerned about it. That's why inside NATO, behind closed doors, people are saying, this can't go on. You've got to end this, Washington. Everyone's at risk. We have nothing left. In fact, the whole tank issue is blowing up in everybody's faces because the tanks are simply not showing up. Suddenly, other European members are reluctant to commit their Leopard tanks. And if I were sitting in their shoes right now, I would feel the same way. Why would I send my armor over there? I might, in their minds, they say, well, once Ukraine is destroyed, we have to be able to defend ourselves. And I think they're right.
To this argument, late last week, General Christopher Cavoli, I don't know if you know him, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, an American general, was quoted as saying Ukraine's losses are, quote, out of proportion to NATO's expectations. Now, that's consistent with what you're saying, but I'm surprised to hear that from General Cavoli, unless this is the type of leak that's intended to acclimate the public to reality.
That could be. Cavoli is the Supreme Commander, Europe, and what he says is certainly going to have a huge impact in Europe. Most people in the United States won't pay any attention, but everybody in Europe will. And so in that sense, you could be right that he's signaling that this is not going to go on. We cannot sustain this. He's not going to come out and say it, but I think that's his message.
Would someone of General Cavoli's position, an American four-star, but commanding American and foreign troops to the extent that he's commanding them, you can tell me what that means, in Europe, have needed the permission of the State Department or the Defense Department or the West Wing to make a statement that profound?
Absolutely. It would have to have been vetted in the White House as well as with the Office of Secretary of Defense, and I suspect the Secretary of State.
He also used a phrase, and maybe this is military science 101, I don't know. Precision can beat mass. Can you tell us what that means?
Well, I did not necessarily use that.
No,
phrase.
you didn't use it. General Cavoli did.
Yeah. Cavoli is not wrong. What you need, though, is the following. Wars are won and have been won, certainly for the last century plus, by accurate, devastating firepower. Your ability to direct accurate, devastating firepower against the enemy at a place and time and space that makes his position hopeless. Let's put it that way. We have precision. Unfortunately for us, so do the Russians. So do the Chinese. This monopoly that we had for years on precision munitions is gone. Now what the Russians are demonstrating is that they understand that you need both. You want precision munitions, precision missiles, precision rockets, but you want huge quantities of them if you're going to win. So Cavoli is trying to sort of be on both sides of the equation. He said, well, precision can beat mass, yes, under certain circumstances. But if your opponent has precision and mass, probably not. And that's the case with Russia right now.
Wow. You and I also talked about some of the behavior of Ukrainian agents and recruiting officials. I don't know if they're military or not, lowering the conscription age to 16. Now, everywhere in the world, a 16-year-old boy is a boy, not a man, not a fully developed man, and too young for the military, but I guess not too young for Ukraine. You and I shared a video. I don't know how old this kid was, 14 or 15, was literally kidnapped right in front of his mother's eyes and shoved into a military truck. They were just walking down the street. What is this going to do for the morale of the people in Ukraine? Is it common or is it isolated? And has the conscription age in Ukraine, this is almost child abuse, been lowered to 16?
My impression is yes, it has. And there are multiple sources confirming that this is the case. And there's lots of evidence being posted by Ukrainians all the time about the true situation. There are pictures of Ukrainian soldiers that are obviously, 15, 16 years of age. So there's no doubt that this is going on. But I think this is part of the larger picture. The Russians went into this economy of force, and they maximized the effectiveness of their connectivity between space-based and terrestrial-based ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, assets above, and gun systems, rocket systems, missile systems. They've inflicted terrible casualties. Whole year groups of Ukrainian men are dead and are gone, have been annihilated. And at the same time, you have this much smaller population from which to draw on, as I talked about previously. There aren't 37 million people in Ukraine anymore. The areas that Zelensky controls, there are perhaps 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 million, which is roughly the size of the population of the Netherlands. That population is mostly male, I'm told, because lots of old men, women, and children have left the country. But still, the men that are there are not all able. Some of them are in advanced age, and lots of them are children. And so they're in desperation turning to this. This regime is at the end. It really is. But it's not going to give up. It's going to fight to the bitter end, and it's going to sacrifice whatever it can to stay in power.
But when will Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin and Jake Sullivan, the people that presumably are making these decisions, recognize what you just said? that the regime is at the end?
I think that for all intents and purposes that message was delivered weeks ago from the Department of Defense to the White House, and it was rejected.
Yeah.
Period.
They're rejecting reality in deference to their political needs. Well, guess we'll hear that in the State of the Union tonight.
Well, I'm sure you'll hear an entirely erroneous picture. I mean, someone asked me today, how did we end up like this? I said, well, we've had 40 years of Cold War, at the end of which the Soviet Union fell apart and we emerged, if not victorious, then certainly healthy and well, and we avoided global war, which was our goal for 40 years. In just 1 year, we faced defeat in Ukraine through this proxy war, but more important, we're on the threshold of a potential confrontation with Russia, something that we worked for decades to avoid. So I guess the answer to your question, Judge, is it doesn't look good. We're not going to admit failure. No one will say they were wrong.
The Russians love anniversaries. February 24th, of course, is the anniversary of the beginning of this military incursion. From your sources, Colonel, does President Putin have his hundreds of thousands of reinforcements ready to pour in to eastern Ukraine and begin marching and killing and destroying on their way west?
Yes, they're ready. That's why I thought that by now they would have already pulled the string, so to say, and have moved north. But the shaping attacks that have been going on down in southern Ukraine have essentially set the Russians up for multiple axes of advance from the south, up towards Zaporozhye, up through the Bakhmut area, and further east up along the border with Russia. I don't know which one they're going to take. Maybe they'll take them all, but that has worked. Why they have not already attacked, who knows? I mean, one thing I'm sure Sorovikin realizes and Gerasimov realizes is that their strategy of enticing the Ukrainians to attack them relentlessly has worked. Ukraine has been bled white. And they may be saying, well, there's no reason to rush. We can wait another 3 or 4 days. Let's wait for additional ammunition. Let's wait for additional whatever it might be. Remember, logistics is important. And they want to push forward ammunition, medical support, more firepower, all of those kinds of things. And it may be they want to push some more forward. But the truth is they could go right now, and there's not much to stop them from going straight north on the eastern side all the way to Kiev.
Have you seen any evidence of demoralization amongst the Ukrainian troops because of their vast casualties?
Anecdotally, you go on Telegram and you look at the things that are being posted in Ukrainian by Ukrainians, and yes, there's plenty of evidence for it. There's no question about that. Also, the hatred and hostility is growing for Zelensky, as more and more Ukrainians are blaming him for the
just let
debacle.
me stop you. Is this hatred from the public, Ukrainian public, from the military, or both?
Well, I'm talking primarily about soldiers in the field, but that may also apply to the population. I just don't have access to that in Western Ukraine. I don't know what they think there. But soldier-wise, oh, absolutely. And they're also looking at very corrupt leadership. You know, there are comments coming in all the time. You're stuffing your pockets with cash, you and the generals, your corrupt leaders, and we're dying, by the bushel every other day. I mean, assignment to Bakhmut for the last couple of months has been essentially a death warrant, and everybody knows it.
Not too long ago, maybe 3 or 4 days ago, the former foreign minister of Poland revealed that at one point the Polish government was thinking of, I don't know how they would do this physically, militarily, and legally, partitioning Ukraine and considering the western part of Ukraine, the part largely untouched by the war that includes the capital, Kyiv, as a Polish protectorate, and thereby triggering Article 5, the obligation of all of NATO to defend Poland, if that part of Ukraine, a la Polish protectorate, were attacked by Russia. I mean, this just sounds, to me, crazy. It almost sounds like the justification Hitler used to combine Austria to Germany to protect Austria, even though the only people Austria needed to be protected from was him.
Although most Austrians disagreed, and they were quite happy to join the German state. I think Hitler's a bad comparison.
Okay.
I think a better comparison would be somebody like Stalin. You know, the man that murdered 16 times the number of people Hitler ever encountered. I think Poland is another state in the region with unfinished business. You've got to go all the way back to the First World War and understand the Second World War was an extension of the First. And then all of the people in the region that were formerly part of Austria-Hungary, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, even the German imperial state or Prussia, all these places fell under Russian domination, Russian communist domination. And everyone was unhappy with it. Everyone hates it, and everyone felt betrayed. The Poles in particular, once they got out from under Soviet occupation and control, always envisioned a time when they would regain their former stature in Europe as a great power. So these kinds of thoughts and strategies have been around forever. The problem is, if they are seriously considering this, and they may be, I mean, it's hard for us to know, but nothing would surprise me. The Poles are romantics to the bitter end. If they think that by moving into Ukraine and claiming that they are acting in the name of NATO and Washington, that'll be the end of NATO. The Europeans will say, you've had it, you're on your own. We're not bankrolling your war to regain your empire against Russia.
Well, we already know that the president of Poland has said his goal would be to claim back Crimea. Now, that is an impossibility, and it's insanity.
Yeah, but you mean Ukrainian president, right?
No, the Polish president.
Oh, he wants to recapture Crimea?
Yes. He wants American troops and his troops and Ukrainian troops to recapture Crimea. This is an impossibility, and I think you'd agree with me. It's insanity for him to say that.
Well, he's obviously on hallucinogenics of some kind that would make him billions of dollars if he could mass produce it. But no, I don't see any evidence for that happening. And again, look at everybody else involved. And I guess you have to make exceptions for people that live in northern Norway that think that might be great, who are on the edge of the West and are totally remote from reality. You may have some of those in England. I don't know. But everybody else on the continent of Europe will walk away from that. There's no chance of that. And that's the end of NATO. People just say, wait a minute. No, we're not joining this war on Russia. Russia is not the Soviet Union.
Is there any chance, no matter what Washington does, that Ukraine can win this war?
Well, of course.
Or that Putin can lose it?
No, of course not. No. Putin isn't going to lose anything. And so, somebody said, well, Putin is weakened and adrift. I said, you mean Joe Biden? They said, no, Putin. I said, no, Joe Biden, not Vladimir Putin. The Russians have a strategy. They know what they're doing. They're methodical. They're deliberate. They're effective. We don't. We never thought through the consequences of our actions. We're all sitting around here and
called up to duty back in the fall, trained, armed, transported, ready to go. I'm assuming trained, armed, transported, and ready to go. Leave that to you to correct me.
No, I think so. Understand that I do disagree a little bit with some other analysts. Scott Ritter has argued it's going to take longer to get them ready. I think they're integrated now. As I said, they're getting the 2 weeks of freezing temperatures. Okay. There is no reason why they cannot attack. And everything that's been happening down in the Donbass, everything that happens with these missile strikes that go in day after day, is all about shaping the battle space, making it safe, if you will, for the maximum offensive power of the Russian army.
All right. In the interest of fairness, and because this is television, and because I like, or it's streaming, because I like to stir the pot, we from time to time have others on than you and Scott Ritter, even though you and Scott are
you have other people on? I'm shocked, Judge.
Are our favorites. This is a person, longtime friend of mine, longtime CIA guy that our audience loves to hate. And I asked him, Jack Devine, about the 300,000 Russians. It's a long answer, but he gets around to answering it at the end. Gary, doesn't he have about 300,000 called up, uniformed, now trained reservists about to enter the theater of war? And if he does, wouldn't that overwhelm the Ukrainian forces?
He had 180,000 the last round. I mean, that's not chicken feed, right? And you looked at it. They weren't armed properly. Where did they get the new arms? Where did they get the training? How did they get so battle ready in 6 months? You're looking at Ukrainians have been fighting for almost a year now. They're as tough as nails. Their strategy, their planning. You're going to send a lot of rookies in. Do they have gas? They have logistics? 300,000. They're going to just march in. They're going to use air power. I mean, do they want to fight? We know what wars are like when people do. They went into Afghanistan. My goodness. I mean, full-blown Russian army went in and was driven off by sheep herders. And why? Because and I'll tell you firsthand, the Russian soldiers did not want to fight in Afghanistan. Are they really going to fight in Ukraine? I mean, it's like you're almost like a civil war, and it's unprovoked. We'll see how. Look at the Iraqi army. How many troops are in the Iraqi army, Judge? 300,000 armed by the United States. Where did they go? They went home. So size isn't the story.
All right, Colonel, I saw you chuckling on the monitor. What do you think?
Well, I
Jack
don't know.
is always going to mouth the party line. I don't know. Maybe
Right.
this would be against the law. Maybe they clip the pensions of CIA officers who've retired and failed to mouth the company line. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I don't see this man as someone who knows much about Russians or Ukrainians. His comments about Afghanistan are really very misleading. The Russian, if we go back and look at the Soviet forces that went into Afghanistan at the beginning, they were overwhelmingly Russians. They went in there and they very rapidly established themselves. Then the subsequent follow-on forces were overwhelmingly reservists that came out of Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. In other words, nearby places. And frankly, these people weren't terribly interested in fighting what was there. But having said all of that, our so-called Iraqi army vanished almost overnight, whereas the Soviet-trained forces held forth for a couple of years after they left, and so did its government.
Does he have a point when he says the 300,000 don't have the will to fight? Or
No.
are these 300,000? I mean, what are we talking about? Are we talking about like National Guard guys who have jobs during the week and they train 1 weekend a month and two weeks a summer like here? Or are we talking about hardened professionals?
Well, first of all, unlike most of your National Guardsmen in the United States, all of these 300,000 have served inside the Russian army.
They
That's
have
very
been
important.
on active duty.
Yeah. And anywheres from 3 to 8 years. And so what they've been going through is essentially updating their training, updating them on the various modernization programs, the equipment that's available. And they've been training for winter fighting. And they've been training very, very hard. The other thing is, I don't think this man really understands anything about Russians or Ukrainians. First of all, we all know Ukrainians are tough. I grew up with them, and I know their war record. They've always been very, very fine soldiers. That's not open to debate. But it doesn't matter how good you are when you're up against overwhelming firepower and you take enormous losses, which is what's happened. On the Russian side, anybody who thinks the Russians are weak is crazy. In fact, I would say these 300,000 are not only enthusiastic about going to Ukraine, I think they have enormous backing at home inside Russia. All the words on the atrocities committed by Ukrainian forces against Russian troops have filtered out to the population, despite the fact that the Putin government has tried to clamp down on it and suppress it, largely because they're afraid of what this anger could produce in Russia against Ukraine. I totally disagree with his entire assessment.
Okay. In the midst of all of this, President Emmanuel Macron of France has weighed in. Here's what he said. I think it was on New Year's Eve. France will continue to help Ukraine, quote, without fail, and quote, until victory itself. We will build a just and durable peace together. Count on France and count on Europe. Is he talking about troops? What is he talking about, as you understand this? Or is this just political pabulum for the French press?
I think it's a combination of all the above. He's also made comments about finding a way forward that's not going to involve compelling Russia to give up all of its gains. He's already said publicly, we can't expect the Russians to give up Crimea. And he said we should have pressed ahead in the Minsk agreements and done a better job with Luhansk and Donetsk and so forth. I think it depends on which audience he's talking to and when you hear him.
All right. Here's General Stoltenberg, the commander of NATO. I call on allies to do more. It is in all our security interest to make sure Ukraine prevails and Russian President Vladimir Putin, he mentions him by name, does not win. This is pretty direct and in your face, Secretary General of NATO to President of Russia, isn't it, Colonel?
Well, let's stop and think about what he's just said. How many times did you hear FDR or any of the leading lights in the U.S. military or the government during World War II complain about the failure of the British or the Soviets to do enough? This is a trick question.
Yeah.
Never. All right?
Right.
That's nonsense. We never made those kinds of comments because they were in the fight long before we were, and they were heavily engaged. We were giving them everything we could to keep them engaged until we could bring force to bear against them. My point is, if this were a successful operation, a successful war effort, you wouldn't be begging your allies to do more. The truth of the matter is that Europeans overwhelmingly want nothing to do with this war, and their governments know it.
Is there military significance to what Secretary General Stoltenberg said? Does he command troops? Can he order troops in?
Stoltenberg is a mouthpiece for whomever governs Washington, for whomever is president of the United States, whatever the administration is. He says and does what Washington tells him to. And he can snap his fingers, he can crack his whip, but you can't create armies and forces out of nothing. It takes a long time to put people into organizations, into formations, train them, equip them. This is not something you do quickly. Frankly speaking, that's why we've been waiting for several months now, watching the Ukrainians impale themselves on Russian defenses, because the Russians are doing exactly that. They're getting ready all of these massive military formations to attack. So what if we start going down the list? And the French army is designed to conduct safaris in North Africa. The British army is smaller and less capable. You know, the United States Marine Corps is larger and better equipped and better organized to fight than most of the European forces. The Poles are now bringing up, we think, 200,000 men. I'm told they've already got 90,000 mobilized, and they're trying to get them ready so that they can build their army up, presumably to defend Poland. But I worry about other things, as we know.
Well, General, I am very concerned about Poland. You and I have discussed this. You know this better than almost